Well, hello. Welcome to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, and I've written some things. And my latest book is In the House of Tom Bombadil, and that actually may come up in the course of our conversation today with our special guest. But enough about me. How about you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, philosophy, and Christian ethics at one of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and I am writing a book on theology, metaphysics, and ethics. So this will be a fun topic today.
Yeah. Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine, Senior Fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, Ministry Associated Reflections Ministries, a few other things, and retired history professor.
Yeah. Well, we have Dr. Jonathan McIntosh with us today. And Jonathan, it's great to have you on the show. I think we're going to have a fun, free-ranging conversation. But tell folks a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I am a Fellow of Humanities at New St. Andrews College. I just started my 17th year here. My first 10 years here, I taught an integrated humanities course, philosophy, literature, a little bit of political philosophy and art and architecture. A lot of guest lectures in that course, so I didn't teach in all of those areas. But the last 6 years or so, I've been teaching a year-long colloquium in political and economic philosophy. So that's what I've been focusing on lately. And I do electives in natural law ethics, mainly political philosophy, some philosophical theology, especially St. Anselm of Canterbury and St. Thomas Aquinas. And then every other year or so, I do my Tolkien elective.
That's rich stuff. Say, you showed us a mug, and there it is. There's the mug with the coffee. And this is this a really an accurate picture of who you are?
It's at least an accurate picture of what my students think I am. So the mug says it's a gift. Mug is a gift from students. It says introverted but willing to discuss Thomistic metaphysics. A gift by one of my students, Sam Gardner.
Right. That gives you like a conversation sort of circle of maybe three people. But anyway, we're those three, I guess, for today.
We're the three.
So one of the things that you're known for is a book you wrote on Tolkien, and it actually got into metaphysics. Maybe that could be a good launching point for us, because a lot of our listeners are Tolkien fans, and we've addressed Tolkien several times different ways. But this may be an approach or an insight into Tolkien that's new to some of our people.
Yeah, so I am an accidental Tolkienist. I had never read the Lord of the Rings until my wife and I began dating.
Wow!
And but was instantly a fan of it. I remember the first time I tried reading the Silmarillion. That many have started and few have finished. And I remember going on a road trip with my wife, again, early on in our marriage. I was reading out loud the creation myth from Tolkien's Silmarillion, the Ainulindale.
Yeah.
And I was just completely lost. I have no idea what was going on, which is ironic in hindsight, because I think I've probably written the longest study of that work to date. But yeah, in graduate school, I was studying philosophy at the University of Dallas, and I was taking a course in Aquinas's metaphysics at the time that I had some friends over visiting from church, and we were talking about Tolkien, and I had asked him if he had ever read Tolkien's creation myth, and he hadn't. So I thought, well, I'll just read a couple of passages. It's a beautiful work for those of your audience. If there's any of your audience who hasn't read the Silmarillion, that's maybe not the case with this podcast. But it's only, about 9 pages, and it's just poetically and philosophically brilliant at the same time. And for those who haven't read it, or even if you've read it, if you haven't ever read it out loud, it really deserves to be read out loud. Tolkien was a master wordsmith. There's many different versions of his creation myth, and he perfected this thing, and every word is just so well chosen. Anyway, some friends were over from church while I was in graduate school, while I was taking this class on Aquinas' metaphysics. So I was deep in the weeds of the essence, existence distinction, and things like that. and was explaining, so I was reading passages and found myself just using Aquinas's categories, metaphysical categories, to bring out some of the subtlety and sophistication of what I thought Tolkien was doing. And I thought, this works rather well. I wonder if there's something here, if Tolkien is drawing from this Catholic scholastic Thomistic tradition. And so I ended up writing my 30-page term paper on possible Thomistic themes, metaphysical themes in Tolkien's creation myth. Ended up having way more material that I could even use in that 30-page term paper, and that's what gave me the idea, hey, maybe this would be a dissertation topic. So ended up writing my dissertation on that, was shooting for around 200 pages and finished at about 400 pages. And then a number of years later, edited it and published it as a book with Angelico Press. So the title of the book is The Flame Imperishable, Tolkien, St. Thomas, and the Metaphysics of Faerie, Faerie.
Yeah, it's a fun title, and it's a really fascinating subject. A couple of things that just occurred to me as we were talking, as you were talking, and one of those is that when it comes to Tolkien and say the approach he takes in The Hobbit versus The Lord of the Rings, and then the Silmarillion. I think if we ever lose sight of the fact of who the author was, and someday far in the future they have source criticism and textual analysis, they'll think there were three different guys because of the range of language.
Actually, Chris, if you follow the rules of source criticism in the Old Testament, you got a lot more than that.
Yeah,
just in The Lord of the Rings. My daughter Elizabeth wrote an absolutely marvelous essay on this that I got to try to get into First Things or Touchstone. That it's just an incredible send-up of the whole documentary hypothesis. But if you apply those rules strictly to Tolkien, you got more than three authors.
Yeah, 30, 40, 50 authors, right? That's right. And then they all have letters J and then K.
Are you familiar with, Chris, you other two, are you familiar with Tolkien's commentary on, this was Lewis's commentary or his notes on Tolkien's Lays of Beleriand, where Lewis is using those same principles. Yeah, it's I forget what volume. Lays of Beleriand. It's one of the volumes of the 12-volume history of Middle Earth, where we have Lewis's own feedback, his response to and notes on I forget if it's the Lay of Luthien or the Children of Hurin. But Lewis invents three different, it's been a long time since I've read this, but he invents three different late 19th century critical scholars who are demonstrating rather conclusively that this work couldn't have been written by the same person. These passages are really good, these passages not so good. So it's both Lewis not able to do anything like a normal human being. Him blunting, I suppose, some of his criticisms of parts of Tolkien that he didn't like by mediating it through these fictitious scholars, and then also
wheels within wheels.
The scholarship that telling Tolkien that he himself couldn't have written.
So, that's great stuff.
Yeah, and with Elizabeth, Chris, you will appreciate this. There's a B source, a Bombadil source. That was originally an opera.
Well, Bombadil is a great example of that. I'd be curious your thoughts on this, Chris. But what I always tell my students is Bombadil fits by not fitting. Yeah. He doesn't. There's a sense in which he doesn't really gel, but that's part of his significance. He has an independent existence, and his within the narrative. Tolkien talks about this in his letters that Bombadil is important, and because he can't be co-opted with the rest of the narrative. He just stands outside of it. Anyway,
well, I think there needs to be a book written, kind of making fun of the autistic sort of fan base of Tolkien and their desperate need to make everything internally consistent. There's this kind of, now, of course, Tolkien was that, but he said, as you note, that Bombadil was an intentionally enigmatic character. It wasn't. He put him in the story just the way you put it for a purpose. Anyway, and then he just leaves it at that and lets us, guess. But I think this is another thing that's fascinated me about both Tolkien and Lewis. And like when I read Planet Narnia, Michael Ward's treatment of the Chronicles of Narnia, I think, of course, if you've read, The Discarded Image, if you're familiar with how, Lewis addresses the planets in the space trilogy, it's just like so obvious that this is what's going on. But he never told anybody. I'm not that way. I tell everybody everything. It's like I'm like the worst person in the world to keep a literary secret. But these guys didn't even tell their best friends what they were up to. All Lewis would need to do is say, Tollers, you don't get it. It's okay. There is a rhyme and a reason to my approach. You might not appreciate it, but it's not just I'm pulling stuff out of the air and throwing it all together. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But let's jump into just the subject of Thomistic metaphysics. Can you just give us a quick synopsis for those? Maybe that's impossible. For those who aren't familiar with it out there in Pugcast land.
No, it's a good question. It's been a while since I've taught Thomistic metaphysics, so I'll have to dig into the memory bank here. So I would say a great introduction for the layperson of Aquinas' metaphysics, I think, is and not just, this is not my view, but a view of other very reputable Thomist scholars, and that is G.K. Chesterton's biography, The Dumb Ox. And
that was a hugely important book for me, by the way. When I read that, it was really paradigm shifting. But go ahead.
Yeah, and there's a story about Etienne Gilson, one of the 20th century's foremost Thomist scholars. If I'm remembering the story correctly, he read it and then sort of threw the book down and said, well, this, Chesterton just accomplished in this little biography everything I've been trying to say my entire career.
Don't you hate
that? And actually, I talk about this a little bit briefly in the introduction to my book and how I use Chesterton's own Thomism as something of a model for maybe thinking about Tolkien's own Thomism, because Tolkien never refers to Aquinas in any of the writings that we have. We know that he had, I think, a late 18th century Latin edition of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. Yeah. Ben Merkel, president of New St. Andrews College, when he was studying in Oxford, I'd heard that there was Tolkien's own copy of the Summa was for sale at, I think it's a St. Philip's bookshop, which turned out to be right across the street from Christ Church College, where Ben Merkel was studying. Yeah. So I asked him, hey, can you go, I can't afford a trip over there to look at this. Could you go look at this volume for me? And so he went in there and he got to thumb through Tolkien's own personal copy. It was multi-volume, this giant tome, and he's leafing through it, and he's got there's I don't know if they're like grocery list or something. They're in Tolkien's own script, bookmarks, and he's old as he just did this. Nobody knows this is here. Anyway, but back to Chesterton and his book.
Before you go on, I wonder what were they asking for it?
I think at the time it was 4.5. This was like in 2007, 2008, and they were asking for £4,500, which at the time, I think my recollection is like a 2-to-1, $2 per pound. So it was like $9,000.
So my guess is you didn't have that kind of loose change on you at the moment.
I did not. And I think the bookshop owner, I'd contacted the bookshop owner and said, hey, I'm doing this work on Tolkien and St. Thomas, and my colleague is over there studying. Would you mind if he came in and looked at it? And he was fine. He brought the books out so Ben could look at it. Ben got the impression that we were interested in buying this, but that was not for that money.
And St. Philip's, by the way, if I remember right, because I was at Christ Church as well. My Dr. Father John Webster, when he was canon there, right across the street. If I remember this, that place you have to go in by special appointment. That bookshop is not one that is sort of, if it's open, it's only open 1 or 2 hours that no one can fit into their schedule.
Okay.
So you have to kind of go look through. You have to kind of set an appointment up to go in and look at the stuff they have.
That's consistent with what I remember how that went down. So, I don't know whatever happened to those volumes, but anyway, so I used in my introduction, I talk about Chesterton's relationship to Aquinas as maybe a kind of model for thinking about Tolkien. And one of the things that I forget his name, a Chesterton scholar has suggested is that, it's a question: how did Chesterton even write such a fine biography of Aquinas? And given that he doesn't seem to have spent much time researching Aquinas, and the thought is he just had this kind of innate philosophical affinity with the mind, and so he was just able to channel Aquinas, even though their philosophical vernacular and vocabulary is very different. That the suggestion is that the way Chesterton viewed the world just kind of tapped into it was similar to how Aquinas did. But back to your question of if I were to summarize Thomistic metaphysics, and here I'm drawing on and showing my dependence on this kind of Gilsonian, what's sometimes called, a Thomistic existentialism.
Yeah.
This idea of the priority of the active existence. Gilson, in one of his histories of metaphysics, I think it's titled "Being and Some Philosophers," kind of goes through the history of metaphysics and shows this tendency to prioritize, especially in the Aristotelian tradition, the act of the essence of a thing, its intelligible form and its intelligibility. And even though Aquinas was deeply Aristotelian, there's an argument to be made that there's a way and a respect in which Aquinas sort of out-Aristotelianizes even Aristotle in appreciating active existence as even more fundamental than the intelligible form of a thing. And that's all bound up with the doctrine of creation, where God, when he brings things into being, he's imbuing them with existence. Yeah. And so to tie this in with the Einolindale, Tolkien's creation myth, one of the things I argued about that work, and here I was pushing against some more prominent Platonic readings of Tolkien's creation myth, according to which, Platonism is about this hierarchy of being where you start with like pure forms and intelligibility, and above that, the one. And Tolkien names his creator is the Iru, which means the one in Elvish. Mm-hmm. And then the one radiates or emanates into these intelligible forms. And so Tolkien gives us the Ainur, the angelic spirits. And then they view all of creation first in music, which is purely form. In fact, Tolkien uses the word abstract form in one of his letters to describe the music. And then you have the music, then you have the vision, where the Ainur, the angelic beings, get to see Luvatar, the All-Father, the creator, Iru. He gives the Ainur this vision of what they've heard, and then he creates the world. Well, on a Platonic reading of that, it's hierarchical, and it starts from higher order, and then it declines. There's a descent from there. And what I argue is that Aquinas, I'm sorry, I keep mixing these up. Tolkien,
it's easy to do.
Yeah, they're all the same. But Tolkien, actually, the progression of his creation myth is not this Platonic descent and decline, but is a Christian. It's Christian and it's eschatological. It's an ascent, where we start with Platonic forms and it gets better from there. Yeah. We start with abstract form, and then because then the Ainur are given a vision, and they're blown away by the vision. We had no idea that this is where this was heading. Yeah. So the vision actually gives more. There's a gratuitousness, a giftedness, a surplus, an abundance to the vision that's not even there already in the music. The music's great. It's wonderful, but it's an initial stage. And then we get this vision, and the vision is more referential and intentional. It points beyond itself. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of self-containedness to the music. Tolkien, the narrative says, the Ainur knew not that the music had any purpose beyond its own beauty. Mm-hmm. So there's a self-satisfaction character to the creation myth. And then the Ainur are given a vision, And the vision elicits in the Ainur a desire. They want more than the vision. The vision promises more than it's able to deliver. And then the creator says, okay, now what you saw, Aya, that's the Elvish word for either it can be indicative, that which is, or it can be imperative, let it be. So it's divine fiat.
Yeah.
And the world's brought into being. And that's the gift of existence, this act of existence that is unrivaled even by the intelligible form or perception of a thing. So that's you want to ask? You asked what's a good intro to Aquinas' metaphysics? I would say read the Aina Lindale, and it's a story of existence. I don't want to say existence over essence in the kind of nihilistic or existential sense, but in the sense that when God breathes something into being, that's like the culmination. It's not just enough to think essence is. We want things to actually exist, and that's part of what the elves represent. It's what the Ainur represent. At a certain level, I think Tolkien even brings in Bombadil. How Bombadil represents, he says, pure natural science. It's just this raw desire of things in their otherness.
Yes,
we want things to exist independently of ourselves. So
there is this sense in which if I remember right, especially with Gilson, there is a sense in which that emphasis on active existence is demonstrating really the ex nihilo character of the gift of creaturely being, because it is suggesting that there isn't merely a kind of a potential already there. That potential is posited along with the act of existence,
right?
And so what you don't have is a kind of it is gift all the way down is another way of putting it, and that's its way of talking about. You don't have like a little abstract substance or just potential sitting there to which all of a sudden act is going to come along and charge it up, but actually with the act of gift of being or existence comes the potential and the actualization, if I remember Gilson right. But I think you made an interesting connection between Chesterton and Tolkien as well. I think Alison Milbank did a book on that some years ago. It was called Chesterton and Tolkien as Theologians.
Right.
And I don't remember. It's been a long time since I read that book, but I did note that kind of affinity right from the start. That she saw those connections as well, and I'm sure it was grounded in a similar metaphysical kind of vision where she made the connections there. And I think the other thing is that one thing Tolkien is able to do is somehow bring out a lot of this is similar to what Aquinas does, is bring out a lot of those aspects of Platonic philosophy that find themselves running into dead ends if they don't have the complement of what Aquinas gets from Aristotle. And so you notice this thing about music. Music was a big thing with the Platonic line, of course, and then Augustine's vision, his elaborations on it, beauty, vision, and all those things. But if you kind of turn these things into if you flatten them, I think is the worry with Gilson with substance talk. You don't really get at the heart of the beautiful insight that creation ex nihilo gives us. And I think what you see with the Silmarillion creation stories, you see all of that stuff thrust into ways of depicting it that really only that form or very few forms are able to capture.
So it might be good at this point to just do a little step back to give a kind of orientation to some listeners who are unfamiliar with some of the basic issues here. So if you think about, the School of Athens, famous painting by Raphael. So, most folks have seen it, maybe didn't know what it was. but in that painting, you've got an old Plato. There it is. There it is.
There it is.
You have
Excellent.
an old Plato, and then you have a young Aristotle, and they're talking, and Plato is pointing up, and Aristotle is saying, look around. And that's intended to express a kind of basic, I guess, disposition or approach to the fundamental questions. So the problem with Platonism is that it has a way of being read to imply that the physical world is somehow second rate. And consequently, we're kind of way down on the bottom of this ladder. And if you really want to be really real, you need to get further up the ladder. So we're at the bottom. Whereas with Aristotle's understanding, he's still dealing with form and matter, usually referred to as essence or substance and accident and that kind of thing. But basically the way, the form, the essence of something is working itself out in its sort of logical kind of trajectory, is that it becomes the thing that you've got. So in modern philosophy, existence trumps essence to the point where essence is completely lost. You get that in existentialism and the nihilism of the 19th century and stuff like that. So I think sometimes in our efforts to recover the essential, to get back to the ideas or to the forms, we tend to valorize Plato at the expense of Aristotle. You see that sometimes with like radical orthodoxy people and stuff. Anyway, I don't know if that's helpful to anybody. That's my attempt to provide an orientation.
You're going to get a cup with a certain.
Another thing that's worth remembering is that when you're dealing with the medievals, they certainly knew the differences between Plato and Aristotle, but they also firmly believed that they could be harmonized. Yeah. Even at their most Aristotelian, Plato is still fundamental to everything that they're doing. So I think, when you're looking at medieval theologians and philosophers, drawing too sharp a distinction between Plato and Aristotle is going to lead you in the wrong direction in terms of understanding what they're doing.
Yeah.
So that's great stuff. So in terms of, say, how this influences, say, Tolkien's approach, I think one of the things that's occurred to me is the complaint that there's never any reference to God, in, say, The Lord of the Rings, or to religion as such. The thing that I always had in the back of my mind was, well, in the New Jerusalem, is there going to be religion, or is everything, significant and understood in terms of its significance? So that you don't have, say, 1 day in 7 set aside for worship. Instead, it's just you're in the presence of God all the time. So in a sense, this isn't, I think, obviously this isn't what Tolkien was doing, but in a sense, the way to approach Tolkien, I think, is to think about kind of the suffusion of the world with meaning, and not needing a religious sort of framework within which to interpret that. I don't know, maybe I'm putting it too strongly, but those are a couple of thoughts that come to mind.
Well, one thing that you have to keep in mind is that Tolkien envisioned all of this as sort of a prehistory of the world.
Yeah.
And he actually at one point explained that the reason why you don't get many direct references to God or anything like that during the course of it is that revelation had not yet occurred. We're millennia pre-Abraham. And so he said, it's wrong to really be looking for this in there, because it hadn't happened yet. Now he does have the dialogue, but I forgot the name.
Athrobeth.
The name. Yeah, the elf speaking to the human, where they ultimately conclude that it's quite possible that Iluvatar might actually enter the world to fix it.
Yeah, it's one of the tensions of the work. You're absolutely right, Glenn, about it. It's deliberately pre-Christian, and so he wants to try to, at some level, recover a kind of pagan ethos, at the same time have it be a highly idealized pagan ethos that's based off of a kind of natural theology. So the elves are all into natural theism, and he even says, there is worship. There's a temple in Atlanta, or not Numenor. I think it's the roof. There is no roof on the temple. I'm trying to remember. They're how they symbolize architecturally the transcendence of Iluvatar. And Sauron seduces the Númenóreans into Melkor worship. So it's a kind of Satan worship, and there's a kind of Gnosticism and Manichaeism there. So there's certainly theology in the Silmarillion, and he talks about in one of his letters how Frodo basically would have known about Iluvatar. He was taught by the elves, Bilbo. So I think you're right on the one hand, Glenn. On the other hand, he tips his hand and shows that there is theology in the background. Right, we see Faramir and his men. This act of grace in the chapter window on the west. It's veiled. Gandalf referring to himself as the servant of the secret fire. So, but that's the absence of religious themes is, of course, quite deliberate. It's deliberate for the historical reasons you mentioned, Glenn. But even that picture is complicated. But I think it's also important aesthetically for him. He wants to tell a fairy story, and fairy stories just tend to not be very theological.
Yeah.
And one of the things I argue in my book is that it's also important for his concept of eucatastrophe, that for eucatastrophe to work, for it to really take grip on us, there has to be a kind of sense of defeat, which is hard to do if you're constantly being reminded God's there to save you.
Right.
So, one of the things I claim is that this is why I think the Ainulindale and the Valaquenta and some of those early chapters of the Silmarillion are important, because I think what Tolkien is doing is he's setting up the metaphysical theology of the thing that will help explain the absence, so to speak, of Iluvatar, of God later on. And one of the passages I point to is, it's the chapter of Aule and Yavanna, when Aule, the Valar who makes the dwarves, he makes these witless automata who can't do anything but move in the way that he directs them, because he jumped the gun, he got impatient. It's a great, I think, both Adam's story and Abraham story, Isaac themes, Ishmael, and so forth, with the dwarves being children of my adoption versus the children of my choice, the elves. There's a Jew-Gentile thing going on there, I think. Just some interesting...
By the way, I've actually heard Jews refer to themselves as the dwarves in The Lord of the Rings. They picked up on it.
Okay. Well, I would have gone the other direction. Ishmael.
I know.
Yeah. Ishmael. Anyway, but in that scene, so Aule makes the dwarves. They can't do anything, and he repents, realizes this was a mistake. He goes to smash them with the hammer. This is another one of those stories. If any in your audience hasn't read the chapter of Aule and Yavanna, it's brilliant. It's amazing. Even just the male-female husband-wife relationship in that chapter is it's not ideal, but it's very human. Let's put it that way. Probably somewhat reflective of Tolkien's relationship with his wife at times.
Sure.
Maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, he goes to smash the dwarves. They flinch. That's because Iluvatar has blessed them with independent souls and has taken them up, elevated them into Iluvatar's own purpose. But then Yavanna is concerned because she's the goddess of living things and plants and trees. And the dwarves are going to cut stuff down. And so she wants somebody to protect them. And she remembers this vision, a part of the vision, the eagles and the Ents. Everybody else, all the other Valar had forgotten about them. And she goes to Manwë and says, hey, I want some trees, basically, that will protect the trees, that will exact vengeance for those who take advantage. And I love Manwë's response. Manwë is the Zeus figure. Right? He's the head god of the pantheon, and he says, "That is a strange thought." And Yavanna says, "But it was in the vision." And then Manwë is treated to a replay of the vision, and he sees, oh yeah, there are the eagles and and the Ents. And the way it's described is, I'm forgetting this. It's been a little bit since I've read it, but it's almost as though he sees Arda, the creation, being upheld by the hand of Iluvatar, while it's almost as though then Iluvatar, with his other hand, so to speak, is interjecting something, this eucatastrophe, in this case, the introduction of the Ents and the Elves. And so I kind of view that as a paradigm for thinking about the theology, how Tolkien thinks about the theology of the Lord of the Rings, which is otherwise a quote unquote atheistic work. It's deliberately, there's the atheos. God is not mentioned, but it's quite purposeful. And it's because Tolkien has this rich medieval metaphysical conception of things where everything is theological. He doesn't see God in competition or rivalry with this thing. So to talk about things is to talk about God. Yeah. Whereas, we modern Christians and evangelicals, we bring God down and put him on par with other things, so that when we tell stories, we got to introduce God as a character, just like other things, because that's what it means to tell a theological narrative. And I think Tolkien, his story doesn't mention God because God is so far down into the DNA of creation,
of everything,
that he can afford to not mention him.
I think that's one of the hardest things to communicate to my theology students, is that for most of Christianity, the way God was conceived is not the biggest thing around the top, the kind of in competition with everything, but as a source and end of all things. All of creation is radiant with that presence. Everything is interconnected through the gift and the moral responsibilities to that you don't have to introduce everything with a quote unquote God qualification, because it's already assumed throughout in human relationships and everything else. And I think that you do this in the book. I know you really show that the metaphysics of creation and his connection of expressing that in this form of, I guess, a new myth. He really saw that as I think one of his primary goals, and I think similar to Lewis and that whole group, is that this is a conception of God and God's relationship to things that has really been eclipsed by the moderns and modern theology, especially now evangelical theology. And I think their service was to give it back to us. We just don't yet know how to figure out how to read it from that form, or we're just learning to.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that's really important and helpful about all of this for the Reformed is this is a way of thinking about providence in a way that we generally don't. We do tend to think of God as the biggest guy on the block, and he's pushing buttons and making us do things. Now, our confession, the Westminster Confession, says that's not how it actually works. But as modern people, we automatically, I'm using that language, we automatically kind of fall into that. And I think one of the things that is interesting too about, say, the creation story of Tolkien, and even other things that he wrote, like Leaf by Niggle, is what is the relationship between God's providence and our work. So in the creation myth, we have the Valar singing, right? So it's not just the one, Eru, all by himself, all alone, decreeing things. There are actually what we could call the angelic host, I think, fairly, who are there. And even in Scripture, we hear the we, and we can say that's a reference to the Trinity. But there's always this sense that the Lord of hosts is God, that there are other beings, other creatures. Now they're creatures; they're not gods in the same sense. But that's a similarity when we think about Iluvatar and the Valar. In a sense, we could say they're like the gods. There's a pantheon, and another way we'd say no, they're actually more like angelic beings. Anyway, just some thoughts that occur to me as we're rambling here.
Yeah. Well. You can also keep in mind that gods with a small g is sometimes used for the angelic host in the Old Testament. Yeah. So the distinction isn't quite as sharp as we might normally think. Another thing that's been floating around in the back of my mind, I don't know if Tolkien was actually aware of this, and Jonathan, you may be able to help here. the idea of religion itself is really, a lot of scholars of religion will argue that it is a product of Christianity. That in fact, in most cultures, and I would argue it in terms of Christianity, it has to do with the tension between the Roman government and the church in the early centuries. Because in most cultures, religion is just part of the fabric of life. It's just simply there, and it's not a distinct area that's different from anything else. With Christianity, you really develop a different way of understanding religion, less so in the Middle Ages, but really, I think it was even there you see it, where it becomes something that is sort of separable from life, from mundane life. You know, we have the secular and the religious. You know, where in most cultures they don't have that. Yeah. And it may be that is sort of implicit here. And, you know, the idea that, you know, as Tom would say, it's gift all the way down, that Iluvatar is so deeply embedded in Middle Earth that you can't escape his presence and his action, even though you don't actually see it.
Yeah. Well, sorry, I'm torn between what Glenn just said and what CR was saying earlier. Which one to run with?
Whatever you want to run with.
Yeah, you can run with both.
Well, why don't we stick with what I feel like I know better. Go back. I'm interested in Chris, what you said about providence and our role, because this is an area where I think I'd sent you guys an article that I'd written on sort of the theology and metaphysics of divine possibility, because this is a topic that I got into kind of post working on Tolkien, and it was really thinking through Tolkien's theory of subcreation and the significance, the metaphysical significance, the contribution that our subcreations make to God's providential plan. You mentioned Leaf by Niggle earlier, and if you think about it, I mean, that is an audacious work, what he's proposing, where Niggle paints a tree, and then God takes that painting and makes it part of his own creation. We see this with Aule. We see this with the Ainur. One of the questions I've had is, you know, how far can we take that? So take something, there's a question that I like to pose to my students, and that is, you know, the notion of where does Hobbit fit in God's providential plan? I think most of us are closet Platonists on this question, where we think of Hobbit as this kind of intelligible form, to go back to our earlier discussion of essences and forms, that exists sort of in the mind of God or in the Platonic cloud somewhere, side by side with men, elves, unicorns, horses, both things that God could make and things that God did make. And hobbits are up there somewhere. And then so God could have made hobbits, but he chose not to, and chose to give this idea of a hobbit to Tolkien. That raises all sorts of questions. One of them, how do we know that Tolkien got the notion of hobbit right? But also it raises the question, in what sense was Tolkien subcreating hobbits if it's just this transcendent form that always was there, and he just discovered it in 1930, whenever he started writing Hobbit. And so one of the ways I tend to put it, and I'm curious what you guys think about this, but it's to say that, you know, for all we know, I mean, God is the Lord of all, and God is not responsive to creation. He is the sovereign Lord of all. But it still makes a difference whether we think of hobbits as something that's sort of in the mind of God all eternally, sort of side by side, even independent of Tolkien. Does God think of hobbits independent of Tolkien, or does hobbits only exist in God's own mind as things that God thought up Tolkien thinking up?
Yeah,
right.
Right.
And if you go with that model, then God is still in charge. He's sovereign either way, but it means that Tolkien has a significance and a status within God's providential plan on that model that he doesn't on our other way of thinking about things.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think one of the places you can go for that is the Ainulindale, where after Melkor's second attempt to assert himself in the music, Iluvatar says to him something to the effect of, okay, I'm going to show you what you did, but you need to understand that no one can promote or propagate or create a theme apart from me.
Yeah.
So he's saying that even Melkor's rebellion has its roots somehow in his own mind, it seems to me. That seems to be the implication of that. You can't come up with any theme apart from me.
Right. Yeah.
Well, in a sense, though, isn't Melkor's theme, though, the sort of the annihilation of the rest of the music, and that's as far as he can go. In other words, he's not a creative.
Yeah, the two
actor.
words that stand out to me in that narrative, he uses the word alter. He says, "No one can alter the theme in my despite." That's the passage you're thinking
That's
of.
the phrase, okay.
There's alteration, and then there's adornment. But the Ainur, he tells the Ainur, adorn the theme. And so there's this idea of taking, these kind of what the Stoics would call the rationes seminales. There's these built-in potencies in the music and the theme that Iluvatar gives to the Ainur, and he's asking them, you unpack them, but it's not just unpacking a suitcase where everything's pre-given. There's real creativity. There's real ingenuity. The Ainur, there's real contingency. You mentioned the Westminster Confession of Faith, and it says, God is sovereign, and part of that sovereign means real contingency in creation.
Right.
And so that means the Ainur can unpack this thing in different ways. So I like that as a pair, adornment versus alteration. What the Ainur do, and what good subcreation does, is adorn. It complements. It unfolds. Tolkien talks about subcreation as the effoliation and enrichment of creation versus alteration, where Melkor's taking it and trying to twist it.
It's interesting because, in theology, it's very similar. When we talk about the offering, the human offering we make to God of the things we participate in as creatures. I often talk about we've done it on the show enough, but we talk about sacraments. You talk about the way in which you're not just given grain and grapes. You're actually giving something that's been formed. Well, let's just use a metaphor: bread and wine. There's been human cultivation in here. Yes, it's taking the kind of potential that is in something, certain ends in it, and actualizing them. But in offering this, there is something about the human contribution in that is not irrelevant, and it is not merely just giving God something back of God. It is something given back of the creature of God. That's something that the creature has had a share in, but not a share in a way that it isn't a gift from God, but it is something that participates in that plenitude of God in such a way that is something God takes true delight in and has a contribution to make to the voice, the music of creation, if you will. It is not just merely a repetition of what it's hearing. It's adding an improvisational line.
That's a couple of thoughts come to my mind because I've been dealing with this quite a bit lately in my book I'm writing on totalitarianism, because totalitarianism has no room for this. It has no room for God, for one thing, but it also has no room for freedom, because everything's about knowledge is control. So, but getting back to this idea, when we think about Adam naming the animals, how did he go about it? Well, the kind of the modern linguistic sort of theory approach is that these are arbitrary vocalizations that he attaches to these creatures. But then we see later that that's not how he names Eve. He actually has some insight into what she is and her unique contribution to the world. And her names, woman and Eve, have a logic to them. So now, in each case, we could say that God's word precedes Adam's words, and in a way, Adam is saying amen to everything God has done, but he's also contributing. There's something that's new, that's introduced through his vocalizations, through his naming, but it's truthful insofar it's an agreement with what God has made. But then there's a development. Now later, of course, in Genesis chapter 11, after the fall, language is reduced to just a tool, an instrument to get what you want in Babel. And at that point, God introduces a little, twist. Not being able to understand you. My own reading of that is that the Babel curse is just simply what occurs to language when you lose touch with the Logos. When you lose touch with the Logos, then everybody's suspicious of everyone else, and you don't have genuine community anymore because you're at that point unable to trust anybody because you're always afraid somebody's going to put one over on you. And that's the origin of the break, or the thing that breaks down. Now, getting back to this idea of not being able to, so if God is being, and he is, that means there's nothing outside of that space that we call being, right? So I like, when I try to help people understand, the sovereignty of God, one of the ways I describe it is, I imagine a room lined with doors. Okay. And every time you open a door to leave the room, you actually come in through another door. In other words, there literally is nothing outside the room. So you just are relocating yourself within God's providential, relationship to being. You're not actually fundamentally changing being. You are now you are doing things. They're real things. You can harm people. You can adorn. I like that. You can adorn what God has made, but it's not as though you're surprising God. Like, oh, I never thought of that.
You're not surprising God, but you are God's own ordained from all eternity means for bringing something into being, for which God didn't devise any other means, right? Yeah. So going back to Adam naming the animals, I love to point out the text says, and whatever Adam named them, that was the name thereof. Right? That's what God himself started calling things. Yeah. He waits for Adam to name them, and then that's what God names them. And again, that raises the question, how do we know Adam got it right? Well, if he was doing it in obedience, then he did it right. And God, so that means there's a sense in which God himself has no other name for a thing than what God ordained Adam to name them. Adam's built into.
Right.
Adam is how God names things, and God doesn't name things any other way but by Adam. And likewise, that's how we know Tolkien got hobbits right, because there is no hobbit except what Tolkien came up with.
That's right.
And anyway.
Well, that is very important for a lot of reasons to get that. I mean, I remember years ago taking a class with Nicholas Lash before he retired. He was a Catholic theologian. One of the things he talked about is most people think of God's creation, but everything a human does isn't part of God's creation. And I used to tell people everything a human does is part of God's creation except for the evil and sin. And it is not merely just part of what God creates, but it is the distinct particular part. There's a different, there is a big difference between particular and, specific. Thomas Fowl gets into a lot of that, but it's the specifics of what each of us do that show that we all participate in that gift in a very peculiar way that never exhausts the plenitude of God, but is able to refract it in some way, both, to be what God wants to do, wants to create through that secondary means. It's interesting, though, that the notion, especially we talk about Thomas's metaphysics or just classic Christian, is the way in which teleology works with all of that, the pulling of all things towards God as their end as well. And there's, I imagine for Tolkien, there is this kind of interplay going on there as well. The way in which, as God's creation points to the Creator, there is evoking in us certain things that does actualize at times things peculiar to the way we're wired and our contribution to them. That is an unfolding of a purpose. That is all heading towards that fulfillment goal, but is very different. In other words, you can have two humans both oriented towards, the beatific vision, but their contributions in life are fundamentally different and for the flourishing of the whole, and say they're both different humans being obedient. And yet you can't say that what they produce is merely just accidental in this kind of theology. So what they're bringing about is definitely something God wants to bring about through it, but it is also something that is what God wants to do through those two. I mean, that's your key point there, right?
Yeah. No, Tolkien came up with hobbits, and he's fundamentally altered the kinds of things that there are, at least imaginatively, for us. And going forward, creation is forever going to bear that stamp of hobbits are now a thing. They weren't a thing until Tolkien came up with it. Not because God didn't know. God ordained for the first, period of creation history that there was no such thing as hobbits. I would submit that 5 minutes before Tolkien flipped over a blank page, he saw when he's grading those exams, and saw that blank sheet and wrote, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." There was no such thing in creation history as hobbits. Had no existence whatsoever. Not because, it caught God off guard, but God, in his providential writing of the history, he left hobbits out for that period. It had no meaning then, and then it did. And going forward, it's now part of
it's a significant meaning. It's inspiring for many people. People, for example, my daughter and my son-in-law refer to themselves as hobbits. they don't refer to themselves that way to sort of denigrate themselves. But then there are other things like duffel puds and stuff like that. And you say, well, how far does this go? I guess we don't need to be afraid of that, but because it just is the case that, at least in the sort of status of existence that hobbits and duffel puds exist, in terms of our consciousness and our literary canon and our, they don't have the same kind of existence as, say, a baby that you've got in the other room, but they exist in a sense that's still significant, playing a role in people's lives.
Jonathan, I guess we talk about a lot about this, especially since we're seeing an increased interest in it, but especially the import of the arts, in the humanities, much less in the Christian vision of thing, and how at certain times that has really taken off, whether it's cathedrals, whether it's artwork, painting, literature, poetry, music, and I think really part of what both the metaphysics of creation in its richest theological forms, and then what Tolkien are up to, they're really talking about, there is that aspect of your point there. It is worth investing in those kinds of things, because those are things God is up to, are doing art, are doing those things. A lot of times we often talk about, well, if the human tries to do it, it somehow is always looked at under this dark cloud, and it can never be seen to still refract. But as Scripture's always talking about bringing, the renewal of all things, the bringing all things back into conformity to Christ, and that this is kind of like building on the cornerstone, right, for an everlasting temple. So this doesn't lose its significance, nor is it merely transitory.
Well, I think one of the things that comes to my mind immediately at this point is a subject that we've touched on many times, and that's the nature of technology. So, does this apply to the computer? Does this comply? If so, then does this apply to artificial intelligence? There's a whole Pandora's box we're opening up here. Any thoughts on that?
Talking about rings of power, right?
right. Well,
there's hobbits and then there's rings of power.
Yeah, well, that's a good thought. I mean, so how do we distinguish our works? Maybe this would be a good way to sort of bring the show in for a landing, because we're getting almost to the end here. Any thoughts that come to mind, Jonathan?
Well, I don't. That is in many ways, the question. I don't know that I can do better than just our earlier discussion. That's why I think that those two categories of alteration versus adornment are so important. It's sometimes it's not easy to tell which is which. I make a computer, I make an iPhone, a smartphone. Have I created something that liberates humanity and helps give us new access to and adorns creation, or have I just enslaved everybody? And, in some of our technology, it does both. And, Tolkien was clearly concerned about this, and tended towards, a profound skepticism of technology. And one of the things I love about Tolkien's work is his willingness to play with these things and bring forth ambiguity. So we get, the rings of power, the same, but the rings that the elves have are instruments of beauty and subcreation. This is why there's Rivendell. This is why there's Lothlorien. But then the same technology is used for creating Mordor and creating domination, and clearly purpose, intentionality is important, but even that's not always sufficient, because Gandalf says, if you gave me the ring, I would intend to use it for good, and it would be downhill from there. It would be horrible. So there, the path to hell is paved with good intentions and so forth. Yeah. So clearly intentions matter, but it can't just be our own personal intentions. We have to cut with the grain of being, of the things that are, going back to what Thomas was saying. And I don't think I have any great insight on that question more than anybody else, other than I think it's a dilemma, a tension that's really the theme of that lies near the heart of Tolkien's work, and trying to get this right. What's the difference between an Aule who makes the dwarves, and he does it because I wanted things that would look at creation, that would look at Arda and marvel at its beauty, but I was impatient. I got ahead of myself. I shouldn't have done this. This was above my pay grade.
Yeah. Maybe over-realized eschatology.
Yeah.
Along that line, you think about, the introduction of technology in Genesis. You got people like Tubal-Cain, in chapter 4 of Genesis, and the scenario or the setting is not all that uplifting. So, but later on, of course, we have the temple, and we have the Ark of the Covenant. We've got all these other ways in which the arts are employed in the worship of God and in the adornment of creation. Yeah. I could tell you were saying something there, Glenn. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah. An odd thought about the elven rings. I'm not sure that they were good. First of all, they are keyed to Sauron's technology.
Yeah.
And secondly, what are they designed to do? They're designed to basically hold back the changes, to hold back time.
Yeah.
Hold back the advancement of history.
Yeah.
Of God's purposes in history.
Preservation.
When you put it in terms of God's purposes, that is probably overstating it. But is the goal of pure preservation necessarily the right goal, even in the context of Middle Earth?
Yeah. No, I may have chosen a bad example. I think it's ambiguous. You're right to point that out. There's something already questionable about the Elvish, even their rings. They learn it. My understanding is they learn that technology from Sauron. I forget
from Sauron.
Details.
Yeah.
So their preservation can be good, and my 5th chapter of the book is all on Tolkien's metaphysics of evil, and I suggest there's sort of 5 different places where evil gets registered. There's lots of different ways of doing this, but this is just a way I find helpful. Is at the level of creation. So we see Melkor wanting Iluvatar's own creative powers. We see evil take place at the level of wanting the power to give being. Then there's subcreation, where you're misusing your power, your rightful powers, your creaturely finitude powers of subcreation, misusing those to fashion things you shouldn't. Then there's preservation, where you're taking things that have been made or subcreated and trying to preserve them in a way that it extends its lifespan beyond what Iluvatar, what Providence wants it. So preservation. Domination, maybe is this 6 categories? Anyway, domination, where you're trying to just exert your will over other things, and then annihilation, where you just want to obliterate being. Right. So yeah, your point is well taken. Maybe a better ambiguous comparison is the theme of splintered light, where we have the Silmarillion jewels.
Yeah.
And maybe you could say that, make the same argument about them as you were making about the elvish rings. But in his poem Mythopoeia, dedicated, written, addressed to Lewis, the hater of myth, Mesomethus, Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia, he uses the image of the sub-creator is this prism that takes in the white light of creation and then refracts it out into many hues. And that's what the sub-creation does. That's adornment. You're taking this kind of undifferentiated feature of creation and you're exploring the potentialities and unpacking them, as to use that metaphor from before. But then Gandalf talking to Saruman, he talks about, he's now Saruman of many colors, and he says the white light can be broken. And Gandalf famously replies, well, he who breaks a thing to find out how it works has left the path of wisdom. I find that really interesting that Tolkien, I don't want to say subverts, but plagiarizes his own image.
Yeah, right. Works it both ways.
So that doesn't help answer the question. It just shows that Tolkien's appreciative of how difficult it can be at the ground level to see what the difference is between lawful subcreation, the arts, going back to Thomas's point, versus these manipulations that are actually evil and corrupting.
It's interesting you mentioned that.
Tom, we really need to wrap up.
Oh, okay. Okay. We'll save it for another time.
That's right. Yeah, I could tell that we were about to launch on a whole new theme. Yeah, we're about 5 minutes over. Okay. Anyway, thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. It's been a fun conversation. We will have to have you back, Jonathan, because Tom has a question, and that will launch a whole other conversation.
Whole other
new show.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And if you would like to support the work of the Theology Pugcast, it would be appreciated. We have costs. We have to pay for the production of the content and its posting on various platforms, and your gifts through Patreon and even through our website help to make that happen. So thanks a lot. We hope you will check out our Patreon site or our website and consider making a donation to the cause. Anyway, that's enough for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy another of our podcasts, The Good Life Podcast, featuring Matt Carpenter interviewing experts in their field about how their work contributes to the good life.